Welcome to the Siege of Orgrimmar Raid Finder Guide to the Vale of Eternal Sorrow. The first boss you encounter in this raid is Immersius, a giant water elemental. This is a relatively easy fight, simply requiring a small amount of preparation before the pull. The boss's room is comprised of multiple platforms surrounding a large pool where the boss is located. The raid must evenly spread out around the boss, with importance being stressed on the healers being positioned so that roughly all areas of the room are reachable by at least one healer. The two tanks should each stand on a platform by themselves in order to handle another mechanic properly, so that two platforms are occupied by no one other than a tank. This mechanic the boss has is an ability called Corrosive Blast. This is a decent damaging frontal cone attack that applies a debuff that increases the damage of subsequent corrosive blasts. This is easily handled by the other tank simply taunting off at one stack. The boss will also spawn small Sha pools underneath players' feet. Simply move out of these. The boss will also periodically cast an ability called Swirl, where he will spew out a torrent of water in a random direction and then begin rotating either clockwise or counterclockwise around the platforms. To avoid this, players must either run far enough away from him to run outside of the range of the swirl, or simply run ahead of him as the swirl rotates. There will also be small Sha geysers on the platforms that knock players up and deal a small amount of damage, but other than being mildly annoying, these don't require too much attention. The most notable aspect of this fight is that the boss is not killed by direct damage to him. Instead, upon his health reaching 0, he splits into a large number of Sha puddles that spread out around the entire platform and attempt to reform by reaching the rough middle of the pool in the middle of the room. There are two types of these Sha puddles: dark colored Sha puddles that need to be damaged and killed by the DPS before they reach the middle of the pool, and light blue colored Sha puddles that need to be healed to full health. Each of these Sha puddles represents a percentage of the boss's corruption, and the fight is over once enough Sha puddles have been killed or healed respectively. The boss will reform once all Sha puddles have either reached the middle or been killed, though when he reforms, he will have less health in respect to how many puddles were healed or killed, making the fight get progressively easier as the time goes on. One thing to pay attention to, however, is when each Sha puddle reaches the middle of the room, it pulses out a large damaging AoE that must be healed through. You cannot stop all the puddles from reaching the middle, as the AoE will pulse out from the Sha puddles you had to heal as well. While most likely not essential in Raid Finder, it is very beneficial to manage a buff that healers receive from the Sha puddles that require healing. Upon being fully healed, the healing Sha puddles apply a buff to players standing within around 10 yards of them that increases the healing they deal by 50%. This buff can stack, drastically increasing the amount players can heal, making it simple with enough stacks to upkeep the raid. Thus, it is important to stand within 10 yards of the Sha you are trying to heal. The fight is mostly rinse and repeat after this. Make sure the group is properly spaced out, taunting off from the corrosive blasts and avoiding the swirl, and this fight is relatively simple. The second boss in the Valley of Eternal Sorrow is the Fallen Protectors. This is a boss trio that actually does not share a health pool, but you cannot simply focus them down one at a time. The way this fight works is one tank will pick up Rook Stonetoe, and the other will pick up Hay Softfoot. Soon Cinderheart does not need to be tanked, although Softfoot tank can stack on top of Tsune for a bit of extra cleave damage. DPS needs to focus on one boss at a time, usually starting on Rook, and DPS them for 33% or 1/3 of their HP. Once 1/3 of their health is depleted, they will become unattackable and perform an ability known as Desperate Measures. Once this mechanic is handled, the boss will become attackable again, and DPS needs to swap to another one of the bosses. Most groups follow the order of Rook, then He, then Tsune, then back to Rook. However, the order does not particularly matter. When tanking Rook, he performs a frontal cone ability called Vengeful Strikes. This does a small amount of damage, but also stuns for the duration. Stun immunity abilities will actually work on this mechanic. The tank simply needs to have his active mitigation ability up. Rook will also throw Corrupted Brew at random players, which simply needs to be moved out of. He will also randomly charge players, dealing a small amount of damage, and then channel Spinning Crane Kick. Again, players simply need to move out of this. Rook's Desperate Measure involves summoning up 3 adds, Sorrow, Misery, and Gloom, in 3 separate locations around the boss's area. Misery and Gloom should be picked up by the Rook tank, while Sorrow should be focused down by the DPS first. Misery applies a ground effect knockback on his main target, which then must be moved out of. Gloom will target random players with a spell called Corruption Shock, which is simply a large damaging single target spell. It is very beneficial to interrupt this as often as possible. Now, Sorrow applies a debuff on a target called Inferno Strike that deals a huge amount of damage, but it is split among the target and all players within 10 yards of that target. To avoid players being one-shot by this ability, stack with them. Afflicted players are indicated by a large yellow circle around them. Stand in the circle to split the damage. Softfoot requires a bit more attention from his main tank, as he will occasionally cast an ability called Gouge, which will completely incapacitate his tank, and then he will focus a random player in the group. To avoid this, the tank must simply turn and face away from him whenever he's casting this ability, and then of course turn back once the ability is done. He will also apply various poisons to his weapon. Instant poison is simply extra damage that must be healed through, and noxious poison applies a ground effect that should not be stood in. His Desperate Measure marks a random player with a debuff called Mark of Anguish, and summons an ad that focuses the player with that mark, dealing gradually increasing shadow damage. Using the special action button that appears when a player is afflicted, players can pass the mark around, so the ad focuses different players. In Raid Finder, simply pass the mark to the tank that was tanking Hay, and then burn the ad. Tsune Tenderheart does not need to be tanked, and for the most part simply does unavoidable raid damage. She will occasionally cast an ability called Calamity, which is a very large damaging AoE that simply must be healed through. She will also periodically afflict multiple targets with an ability called Shadow Word Bane, which is a dot that can be dispelled. Now the interesting thing about this dot is that when it is first applied, it will start at 3 stacks, though these stacks do not actually affect how much damage the dot is dealing, but instead affect how the dot spreads. If a dot has more than 1 stack, it will jump to another player and of course decrease in a stack, essentially spreading the dot around. Thus it is very beneficial to dispel immediately, otherwise the dot will spread and many players will wind up having the debuff. Quick dispels drastically reduce the damage that this dot can deal to the raid. If you aren't quickly enough, the dot can spread around, wind up on multiple players, and take a long time to dispel. Tsune's Desperate Measure summons up a bubble in the middle of the room which players should stand in to reduce the continuous AoE damage she does during this phase. 2 ads are summoned in the room that spawn multiple Sha that should be killed. All damage dealt to the Sha that are summoned are also dealt to the ads, so DPS can simply damage any hostile mobs during this phase. As the bosses do their Desperate Measures every 33% of their HP, you will deal with their respective mechanics twice during the fight. The last 33%, the bosses need to be brought down evenly, as if one is killed before the others, it will begin casting an ability that will heal itself up to roughly 15% of its HP, if the others do not die before the cast is complete. Simply put, the bosses must all die at the same time. To summarize, make sure the He tank is facing away for the Gauss, players need to stack for the Sorrow's debuff, always prioritize ads over the bosses, and make sure the bosses die at the same time and the fight goes rather smoothly. The third boss in the Valley of Eternal Sorrow is Neuroshin, and though you do not actually fight him, rather you face an amalgamation of corruption within yourselves. This corruption deals a lot of steady damage to the entire raid that ramps as the fight goes on, and all players deal drastically reduced damage to the boss at the start of the fight due to starting with 3-Force Corruption. Corruption is a mechanic that is specific to this fight. In order to deal full damage to the corruption, players must complete a solo-phased encounter to be purified to remove their corruption. Unlike in normal and flex raid difficulty, players are selected completely at random and ported into these solo encounters, so the raid group has no control over when this occurs, and I will cover the mechanics of these encounters in a little bit. The first ability the Amalgamation of Corruption has is Unleashed Anger, which is a decent damaging attack that also applies a debuff that increases the damage of subsequent blows from this mechanic. To handle this, simply taunt off at 3 to 5 stacks, or whenever the off-tank stacks fall off. The corruption will also summon a beam of death called Blind Hatred that will rotate around the room slowly, either clockwise or counterclockwise. While it does move very slowly, it does a lot of damage if it hits you, so make sure to avoid this. Two types of adds will also be spawning during this fight. The first of which resembles small stationary Sha that do not need to be tanked, and they cast a small ability that buffs the boss and should be burned down quickly. Large Sha adds called Manifestations of Corruption will also spawn, and these need to be picked up by the off-tank quickly. Important to note is that there is a chance that the off-tank will be in the solo encounter, so pay attention to the buffs on the other tank to be sure whether he is or not, as if the other tank is gone, the tank who is currently tanking the boss will also need to pick up the adds. When these larger Sha die, they leave behind a shadowy orb that pulses out a large amount of damage to the raid. These need to be picked up by players with less than full corruption. To remove a player's corruption, again, they must complete the solo encounter tailored to their role. Tanks will be pitted against a Titanic Corruption, who will deal a variety of attacks attempting to kill the tank. Aside from basic attacks, the mob will also use a frontal cone attack called Titanic Smash that must be avoided, a spell called Hurl Corruption that must be interrupted, a spell called Burst of Corruption that should be mitigated by a defensive ability, and finally Piercing Corruption, which cannot be mitigated or avoided and the damage must simply be survived. Tanks do not have to kill this add, they simply have to survive for 1 minute, though killing the add will shorten this. Healers are placed in a scenario facing a greater corruption, with the aid of 3 Pandaren spirits, Levin Dawnblade, Rook Stonetoe, and Soon Tenderheart. Healers must heal themselves and the spirits aiding them for 1 minute, though keeping the spirits' HP high increases the damage they deal, making the scenario go faster. Healers will also have to dispel a debuff the corruption will place on either themselves or one of the spirits periodically, as well as moving out of ground effects that the add will be spawning. DPS will be placed in a scenario where they are facing several adds. These attacks will cast frontal cone attacks or frontal line attacks that need to be avoided, and the small Sha adds will occasionally create a shield that stops all attacks from hitting the front. To handle all of these, DPS simply needs to make sure they are standing behind the add. Once all the adds have been killed, or 1 minute passes, the DPS will then be returned to the normal phase. Damage will be ramping as the fight progresses, so save large healing cooldowns for the end of the fight, and make sure to do the solo encounters correctly, which will be entirely up to your own skill and not your group's. Kill the adds quickly, pick up the shadow orbs, and stack whenever possible to help out your healers, and the fight should go without too much trouble. The Sha of Pride is the final boss of the Veil of Eternal Sorrow, Siege of Orgrimmar raid, and can be an easy fight, though it can easily lull you into a false sense of security as the difficulty incredibly ramps up at specific points in the fight. At the start of the fight, you'll notice a meter similar to the corruption meter in the previous boss fight, except this keeps track of your pride and starts at 0. Certain abilities the boss does give you pride, and depending upon your levels of pride, depends on what mechanics you have to deal with at specific points in the boss fight. In Raid Finder, it is solo tankable. However, it is usually a good idea for the off-tank to stay near the main tank in order to handle another mechanic present in this fight. The 2 tanks will stand themselves near the entrance of the room, slightly closer to the leftmost circular pattern on the floor shown here. The rest of the raid will stack on Garrosh's discarded weapon and only move for certain mechanics. In Raid Finder, the boss has no special abilities that he uses on the main tank, making this the easiest fight to tank in the Veil of Eternal Sorrow Raid Finder. The boss will periodically apply a dot on certain players that must be dispelled. However, not everyone should attempt to dispel this mechanic. Neuroshin, the Titan construct, will aid you in this fight by buffing random players. And there will always be at least one healer with this buff, called Power of the Titans. This makes the player immune to gaining pride. Only players with this buff should be the ones dispelling the dot, as dispelling the dot otherwise will give you 5 pride. Make sure to pay attention so that if you receive the buff, you can immediately start dispelling. The boss will also periodically summon Reflections, which are small Sha adds that do not need to be tanked. Players need to spread slightly when these adds spawn, as they deal a decent amount of damage and give pride to the players standing within 2 yards of their spawn location. Players do not need to move far, just enough to not be right on top of them. Afterwards, the adds should of course simply be AoE'd down. Boss will also periodically imprison random players in 2 locations on the room marked by the circular patterns on the floor. One prison will be to the left of where the DPS stack, and the other prison will be roughly to the left of where the tanks are standing. 2 sections of each prison will be glowing orange, and players need to stand on these sections to free the imprisoned player. This is the reason the two tanks should be standing together on the other side of the room in order to handle the prison there. Once free of the prison, the DPS should simply move back to the stack point. The boss will also spawn a Sha in the back of the room behind the DPS that should be quickly burned down. This ad will cast Mocking Blast, which will give pride to any player hit, so DPS should interrupt, stun, or silence the ad to prevent this. Upon dying, the ad will give 5 pride to the closest 2 players to it. This is mostly unavoidable in Raid Finder. If you are high in pride, make sure other players are closer to the ad than you are. The boss's most dangerous ability is an ability called Swelling Pride. This does a fairly large amount of damage to the entire raid, and adds 5 unavoidable pride to all players. The dangerous effect of this ability is also what it triggers depending on each individual player's pride. If players are under 25 pride, nothing occurs and this effect is ignorable. If players have 25 to 49 pride, however, they will spawn a burst of corruption underneath themselves that will explode for a large amount of damage after a few seconds. This is the leading cause of death in this boss fight. And make sure that if bursts are spawning after Swelling Pride, that you spread away from them so you're not caught in the ensuing blast. Once the bursts are done, you move back and stack again. If you have 50 to 74 pride and are hit by the Swelling Pride ability, you will spawn a projection. This will only be visible to you and you must quickly run to and stand in it, or else a large AoE explosion will hit the entire raid after a few seconds for a large amount of damage. If you have more than 75 pride but less than 99, and you are hit by Swelling Pride, you'll have a debuff placed on you for a few seconds that pulses out an AoE from you that deals a decent amount of damage and gives pride to any other player hit by it. This means that you cannot stack with the group any longer until that debuff wears off. If a player has 100 pride and is hit by Swelling Pride, they are mind controlled and must simply be killed. When the boss hits 30% of the HP, he will kill Nourishing. This means that players will no longer be gaining his buff, and thus healers should only dispel if players are afflicted with 2 or more stack of the dot. Luckily, before he dies, Nourishing will wipe all pride from the group, so don't be afraid to dispel, even without the debuff, right before he hits that point. The boss will also start dealing heavy raid damage at this point that must simply be healed through. This is the point in fight where heavy healing cooldowns should be used, as well as DPS cooldowns and Bloodlust. Make sure to free people from prisons. The healer with the Power of the Titans remembered to dispel quickly. Spread away from reflections, watch for bursts of corruptions when they spawn, and the fight should go without undue difficulty.